lovelies. Hope you're all doing well, though statistically speaking, that's probably unlikely. Let's deal with some comments. I don't have a lot else to talk about. There's an open art call for anyone who wants to apply to do some stuff for the next Korean Adventures RPG. More deets on the blog, postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. Other than that, not a lot. So, on my Mage review, Ensign Redcoat says, not just my favourite WOD game, but my favourite RPG full stop. If I could only own one RPG book, it would be Mage 20. This game speaks to me like no other. And for the final time, fuck the Avatar Storm. I agree. And the horse it rode in on, or designer it rode in on. Yeah, it's definitely one of my favourites. It's up there. Whether it's number one or not, I don't know. I find it very difficult to rank things, but Mage is a brilliant game, as was. I never really understood the point of the Avatar Storm, because it was meant to be this whirling mass of soul fragments between the Umbra, the spirit world, and the real world, but it never affected the werewolves, which never made any sense to me whatsoever. And if the werewolves could avoid it, then a mage with spirit should have been able to avoid it, and there was no way that the Sons of Ether or the Void Engineers weren't going to find some sort of way around it. It was this huge, nonsensical piece of crap. What? And it just made no sense. I don't know. I don't even know why they bothered doing it. Should have left it in Wraith. Smitumi says, okay, that's pretty interesting. I flipped through it years ago, but it did seem very dense. What do you think of Cult and Unknown Armies? Oh, and Urbanski's Magic game. I have not read RPG Pundit's game. Excuse me. Unknown Armies, I have quite a lot of the earlier edition, and Unknown Armies is fun, and it's a good game, but the magic in it, you're kind of, what's the point? Because it doesn't do very much. It doesn't make you capable of very much. It doesn't make you meaningfully different or more powerful or anything compared to normal people. But it's an interesting game nonetheless. As for Cult, love Cult. Ran some very successful games of Cult. The black cover edition, Death is Only the Beginning, that one. The newer edition, Powered by the Apocalypse, rubbish. First edition wasn't that great. Second edition, I mean, the rules are a bit clunky, but that's the one I like the best. On the review of Into the Deep Wilds, the latest pile of stuff for Privateer Press, Doc Necrotic says, it saddens me that Privateer Press barely exists, limping along thanks to 5e products. The Warmer Hordes game was good fun, but it's barely there. Funny how their ship book is superior to the Spelljammer, though. Yeah, you would think with all the colossal fuck-ups that Games Workshop has been involved in, that Privateer Press would be there ready to sweep in. Certainly a lot of their miniatures and their story and stuff seems like it should appeal to a lot of Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 players, but for whatever reason they didn't. I do see displays of it being played or presented on the rare occasions that I do get to a physical game shop. Yeah, but yeah, it is a shame they're limping along due to 5e products when their own RPG was somewhat superior, and their tabletop game is good. It's a shame. I don't know. I'm not into the deep company lore of why Privateer Press isn't doing so well. I thought they moved and set up a their own internal production line or something. Maybe that left them without much liquid capital and less agile when everything went tits up the last few years. I don't know. Kit Marlowe says, I totally understand the desire for writers to want to tell stories about their settings and to develop them, but this has two problems. First, as you say, it risks over-defining the world for GMs. Second, in extreme cases, I'm looking at you, Symborum's Throne of Thorns campaign, it can make subsequent books almost unusable unless your game has followed the assumed narrative from previous books. I think Hahn got this right by insisting that all official setting material must stop at a certain in-game date to allow groups to use that as a common foundation for their own stories. I realise looking back on that review and what I said there, it may be seen as somewhat hypocritical, considering that I did create Whitechester with the explicit purpose of detailing absolutely everything within an early modern city. But that was about a location, a singular location, and hints about the world around it. So it's not quite the same thing. And yeah, I do think there is a balance between the two. Some people buy books to read the lore and immerse themselves in the world rather than necessarily to play, so it can add value to a book if you include such information. But I need to find a better way of expressing this. But, you know, as a game designer and as a games master, your job is not to tell stories, but it is to create an arena, a context in which stories can be made or can come about. But that's at direct odds with this authorial intent, I suppose. Hahn's approach is interesting. The thing is, the ever-advancing story and ever-advancing detail and revelations, you know, that was the model that worked really well for White Wolf games. You know, they had their meta plot for all their individual games and for their games as a whole, and so to keep up with the story, you had to buy all the books. It's essentially almost like an early form of transmedia, and that worked for them for a long time, until they had to come good, and then they didn't stick the landing. So I don't know. There are times when detail is appropriate, and there are times when it's not, and there must be a sweet spot between the two. Liberal Hyena says the wild animals / druids version of War Machine is called Hordes, which has led to the unofficial but deeply regrettable conflation Warmer Hordes. I, of course, prefer War Machine as my conflation. Apparently, it's all been folded into one and is just called War Machine again now, which is a pity for those of us who enjoy playing with language. On the tax and benefits situation here in the UK, His Majesty's revenue issues. The cartographer says, this is like deep lore of English oppositional politics. The cartographer says, yeah, considering the Shadow Chancellor is Rachel Reeves, who, when working for Ed Miliband, promised to be tougher on benefit claimants than the Tories, and considering David Lammy has already publicly made excuses for why Labour won't undo any of the changes the Tories have made, it will take too much time, I would not hold my breath for Labour not enforcing this to the hilt under the banner of fiscal responsibility, because it's fiscally responsible to oppress the disabled while handing billions to oil companies in subsidies, of course. Thanks for the video and the advice. We'll be sending this to a few disabled creatives I know, and hope it's enough to keep whichever big brother this country elects from noticing them. Kind of negative and depressing. I mean, Labour is better than Conservatives, even if it's either significantly or just barely, depending who's in charge at the time. Labour's certainly playing it cautious, so my hope is that if they do get in, they will be a bit more on the reformer and fixing things line than they're currently presenting. there is this kind of petty cruelty side to certain aspects of British culture. I'm all right, Jack. I'm doing okay, but so people who aren't doing okay, fuck them. Who cares? There is that nasty sort of aspect to certain parts of British society, and that's what these kind of policies appeal to. People hate the idea of benefit cheats, even though it costs more to pursue them than you ever recover. It would be fiscally responsible not to investigate everybody, because it's a huge waste of money. It would be far more fiscally responsible to go after the Vodafones or the Googles or Elon Musk's assorted companies who all avoid tax. Just Vodafone's bill that they're supposed to pay, them alone, that would completely fund the NHS for a while, on top of the existing budget, of course, and massively improve it and otherwise. Of course, there are other issues, such as the continuing impact of Brexit. But, going after the poors, who are demonised by the right-wing tabloid press constantly, and the government constantly, always seems to be a bit of a vote getter with the nastier side of British society. Salsa Doom says, I know a lady who breeds a certain type of dog. A few years ago, the pups were selling for $6,000 a piece. Just one litter had 11 pups. She sold them online and didn't pay a cent of tax. I would hope that is the sort of person who the weasels are after, not Bob in the wheelchair making a few bucks on the side. On saying that, it just takes one overzealous bureaucrat to start ruining people's lives. Before online sales, it was so expensive to investigate someone that they would only go after the big fish. That's the downside of an easily accessible digital economy, I guess. I am kind of wondering if some of this might fall afoul of privacy legislation, but then we're outside the EU now, so who knows what's going to happen to those protections. They're probably going away. Your example of the woman, right, that's not going to happen that often. And here's the problem as I see it, right? Say you're a person in the UK and you are on disability benefit. You have already had to jump through innumerable hoops. You have already been examined by a total amateur who then decides whether you get that benefit or not. About 80% of those they deny eventually win their support by tribunal, but their job is to deny it to you. So the whole process, twice for me, it took a whole year to correct the issue and get them to cough up to assist me. So that $66,000, what is that, £60,000 or whatever, might potentially have to last that person for years. A couple of disasters, no other income, that's really not gonna last that long if you put it into that context, right? And a windfall like that isn't gonna happen that often. So there's just no human factor, there's no understanding to it. And retaining the benefits that you're owed is incredibly stressful, and applying for it is almost a job in and of itself. And so the occasional windfall, I don't think, should make that much difference, really. Mark Sharp says, this new tax policy thing might cost more than it brings. Unfortunately, we have bureaucratic functionaries to deal with. Little Napoleons. It probably will end up costing more than it brings, and negative publicity as well. But that's conservatives for you. Jason of the Hills says, every time I get frustrated with my good old America, I have to remind myself that you guys have to deal with agencies with His Majesty's in the title, and things just seem a little bit better. I don't know. There's some sort of old world charm to dealing with, royal warrants and and His Majesty or Her Majesties or whatever. It's. I mean, I'm a small R Republican, but even so, it's charming to an extent, and the livery and so on, and the badges and so on are far more appealing and interesting than the American Eagle, I think. But I mean, lest we forget, America, since I think the fag end of Bush, has been trying to pursue American citizens abroad and take a share of their income that they're earning and already paying tax on in their host countries. So it's not just people with weird names and titles that are going after ordinary people's money and ignoring the big boys. So I think that's what's more important than whether they wear a tricorn hat and gold-trimmed red coats. I think it's more important that they're actually going after you than otherwise. And at least we can laugh at ours a bit. John DeWolf says, you need to be really careful with this kind of advice. Suggesting that people are paid in cash so they wouldn't have the income in their bank accounts could be considered to be providing tax avoidance advice, which can lead to a criminal charge here in the UK. I think everybody knows that cash in hand is a way to avoid taxation, right? Tradesmen have been dealing on that basis for a very, very long time indeed. So I don't think that's exactly a revelation to anybody, and the rest of my advice was all completely legal and more to do with making it easier to keep your accounting separate and so on. And again, if something so obviously well known as dealing in cash could get me arrested, how do all these tax avoidance schemes operate? How is it that there's this whole industry of helping big companies avoid tax? Yeah, I think not. Nalathotep 666 says taxation is theft, and this sentiment was repeated by several people. Taxation is not theft. Taxation is one half of our formalised social contract with our governments. As a citizen of a country, we participate in that country. We pay into the public purse, which is then dispersed with all the advantages of economy of scale to improve society for everybody, including us, far more effectively than we could do so privately. At least ideally that's the case. And the other half of the social contract is that these expenditures are spent according to our expressed democratic wishes. Currently in the UK, we are being taxed more than we just about ever have been by a Conservative government, which is traditionally low taxation, and we're getting fuck all for it, and instead they've been handing out money to their mates. That's the problem. They have breached the social contract. It's not that taxation is the problem, it's what they're doing with it, or not doing with it, as the case may be. Yeah, that's the issue. But taxation is not theft. For a start, it's legal, so therefore, definitionally, not theft. On the Candela Obscura review, Babylon 9406 says, I felt the same thing coming from the 5th edition Vampire the Masquerade. That is, the sanitized horror stuff. A game about being a monster, a leech, a parasite, and the book shied away from this essence. Truly a shame that Candela seems to also have done it. Yeah, horror games without the horror. I saw someone else commenting today that they feel that the sanitization of kids' media is a bad thing. That today you couldn't subject someone to Artax or Watership Down, and that somehow being traumatized by those things made us better in preceding generations. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but I mean, life is hard, horrifying, emotionally difficult, and maybe dealing with it safely through media is a way of building calluses and defenses on those emotions, perhaps. So maybe there is a utility to it. In a perfect world, none of us would ever be traumatized by anything, I suppose, but this is not a perfect world, so sanitizing our media doesn't really seem to make much sense, particularly when that's media for adults, like most horror role-playing games. Your mileage may vary. On fresh introductions, Oliver P96 says, I think it's one of the reasons RPGs are good for those of us struggling with depression. It's easier to find motivations for our characters than it is to motivate ourselves. I'd love to hear more about the sort of RPGs you love to play and that you feel push the art form. Maybe a Grim Jim version of a top 10 list. I've been really appreciating your perspective on TTRPGs, but haven't had much luck in searching your back catalogue for games you recommend to newcomers, or if there's any games you play regularly. Talking about the games you love might offer some respite. Well, Mage was something I really loved. Really love. So talking about that has happened. Motivations for characters versus motivations for ourselves. This is an underlying idea behind the whole fake it till you make it thing, where act as if you're successful until you are successful. In Chaos Magic, there's the idea of the fiction suit, where you adopt the persona of a fictional character in your life and live your life as that fictional character, which strikes me as being a bit OTT. But I think that is reflected somewhat in, we get relief. It's easier for RPG characters to make idealistic decisions that we would like to make in real life, but real life is too prosaic and practical for most of us to make such decisions on such a basis. I don't know, tricky. Maybe I'll talk more about games that I love. Maybe I'll indulge you and do a top 10 list of most favoritist games ever. But I struggle to rank things like that. It's difficult for me. On the Wretched RPG review, very few people had much to say about the RPG side, but there were lots of interesting side comments, of which I have extracted two. Cthulhu Kafan or something, it's a misspelling, I don't know. Dyslexic Cthulhu says, just my opinion, but Crossed is disgusting and lacks any redeemable quality. The concept is interesting, a disease that disfigures people and removes all inhibitions, but it's used merely as a framework to see how disgusting someone can be. There's a villain who has a legless redneck strapped to his back who beats people to death with a horse penis and who yells horsecock repeatedly. At one point, the Crossed spread the disease by ejaculating onto arrowheads, and so on and so on. I'd heard of it and acquired the first 4 trades, and for the first time in my life I was so repulsed. I gave them to a curious friend because I didn't want to put them in my trash and wanted no evidence they were mine. No offence if anyone likes them, but it's no surprise only Avatar would publish it. So some of the storylines are more interesting, as I believe I mentioned in the video. But this is kind of what it's supposed to be, disgusting OTT without inhibition in terms of what there is depicted in the comic as well. There are plenty of films that follow this kind of line, splatterpunk type stuff. There is a film strongly derived from Crossed. I think it's Korean. Can't remember the name offhand, but people are crying while they're committing these atrocities in that film. That should give you enough information to find it wherever it is. What I find interesting about it is that it's kind of a zombie apocalypse, but with intelligent, living zombies who just do horrendous things. So they're still largely stupid in some ways, in that it's all about instant gratification and so on, of the darkest urges. But there's still a lot more interesting than just zombies. So for me, that's fascinating, and it's even harder to understand how anyone could survive in such a world. So that to me is what's interesting about it. And getting a disgust reaction out of people is a lot easier than getting a horrified reaction out of people. It's much easier to invoke disgust than horror. And that's something that it's useful to know when it comes to role-playing games within the horror genre, or the darker side of whatever genre you prefer to play. Them Kachuk, I don't know. Them C Chuck says, disagree amicably on important things. Never again. The left never ever backs down or gives in. They're in it to win it. Culture war is war. Does the left never back down? I'm not sure. Does the right never back down? Are they still pushing trickle-down economics when it's failed consistently and forever wherever it has been applied? Earlier we were talking about the tax thing, right? That's the right going after the disabled, the jobless, people on the margins, vulnerable people, and that's not fiscally responsible. Are they ever going to back down on that, on trying to impose their unrealistic version of morality on people using economic and police principles? How are we supposed to come to any sort of compromise where both sides back down if we never communicate? And you got to communicate. Even wars end with an armistice and a negotiated peace settlement. So communication is necessary even in war. The only time it isn't necessary is if you're engaging in genocide, and culture genocide doesn't seem like a thing that can really happen exactly. And finally, on the Kalergi Plan video, there were a few of the usual comments, but Sammy G says, Grim Jim's argument is that if there's no evidence for a replacement plan in the book, then there must not be a replacement happening. But that's just not true. Every human with a pair of functioning eyeballs can see there's obviously an agenda being fulfilled in some way with mass immigration. No, because we can't see that. But no, that's not my argument in the first place. The Kalergi Plan videos are specifically addressing the conspiracy theory that there is a replacement plan, that Kalergi is behind it, and that he expressed that replacement plan, particularly in his book, Practical Idealism. No such plan exists in the book. Kalergi does not appear in any of his works to have had any sort of agenda. Rather, he was predicting that certain socio-economic forces and interpersonal forces would create change in the demography of Europe over time. He was correct in his predictions, but there is no outline of a plan, no advocacy for a plan, nothing of the sort in any of his work. Addressing just the question whether there is a great replacement happening would require a different video, which I may get around to doing at some point, but that's not the argument in either of my currently existing Kalergi Plan videos. Go stick your head in a pig. Activate 2.0 is the sequel and second edition to Activate, inspired by the likes of Global Frequency, Person of Interest, crypto, piracy, and other issues. This is a game where you play activists and experts brought together to change the world in a positive and meaningful way by mysterious forces lurking in the darker side of the internet. You can download it or buy the print version at all the usual places: host-mort.com, drive-thru-RPG, and lulu.com.
Down before your eyes, the actor screaming agonizing cries. Another useless reason to despise the secret life that everyone denies. That secret life that everyone denies. That secret life that everyone denies. You're a star now. You go far now. In the Nero Daughter Show. In the Nero Daughter Show. You're on stage now. Disengage now. In the Nero Daughter Show. In the Nero Daughter Show. Nero Daughter Show.